After the Korean War, our people were shocked to learn the American soldiers fighting all over the world were so ignorant of American history and the concepts of our great republic, as well as totally uninformed regarding the objectives, plans, and tactics of the enemy, that some readily capitulated to the enemy's propaganda. You know the story. Therefore, our government ordered a program to educate our forces. This educational program was implemented in Germany by General Edward A. Walker, and the author of this program was Major Arch E. Roberts, our speaker today. This program, called Citizenship in Service, and given to members of the 24th Infantry Division in Germany, as you know, caused the military muzzling controversy, which resulted in a lengthy Senate investigation. On the 30th of August, the entire text of the pro-brew program was inserted into the Congressional Record by Senator J. Strom Thurmond and John G. Towers. I was in Washington attending the 71st Continental Congress of the Daughters of the American Revolution 3 years ago, when Major Roberts was ordered to be our speaker. Major Roberts spoke, and he was critically attacked by the national press for defying Pentagon muzzling. The Pentagon immediately confined Roberts to his post at Fort Lee, Virginia, and on the 7th of May, the Secretary of the Army relieved him of active duty and directed that he return to his home in Colorado. Roberts, a veteran of 18 years, 9 months active duty, at the time of his ouster, 1/3 of it spent overseas, subsequently brought suit against the Secretary of the Army, charging violation of public law and abridgment of constitutional rights. On the 18th of June in 1964, the U.S. District Court of Appeals directed that Roberts be reinstated and that further proceedings be conducted to determine, quote, the extent of the relief required, unquote. Major Roberts is an ex-paratrooper and served with the 11th Airborne Division, the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, the 101st Airborne Division, and the 3rd Infantry Division as an Army Information Officer. A graduate of the Command and General Staff College, the Armed Forces Information School, the Airborne School, and the Medical Field Service School, he enlisted in the regular Army at Denver, Colorado in June 2nd, 1939. He will tell you the rest of the story. Major Roberts.
Thank you very much, Florence, and thank you all for your kind reception. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be able to follow Dr. Norris on this platform. Dr. Norris, in my opinion, is one of the most effective fighters and the most knowledgeable fighters in this underground struggle for the Constitution. And unknowingly, he has prepared the groundwork for my presentation this afternoon. Neither of us, of course, understood what the other was to present, but it just worked out. I couldn't have planned it better myself. Now, several weeks ago, I had the unique privilege, and it was that, of addressing a joint session of the Alabama legislature. And my topic was the United Nations. Now, of course, the planners tell us that the United Nations is the hope of the world. But the United Nations is not the hope of the world. Jesus Christ is the hope of the world. But I'd like to bring to you the Montgomery concept and the presentation, at least a part of it, that I presented to the legislators in Montgomery, because I believe that the Alabama syndrome reveals that the states in the South comprise the target area for a planned revolution. And I believe that we must determine the causes for this revolution. And I believe that we, the people, must do whatever is necessary to ensure domestic tranquility. And I say to you that it is no accident that Montgomery, which, as you know, was the capital of the Confederacy, it is no accident that Montgomery is the focal point for today's anarchists. As a matter of fact, Dr. John Morsell, who is the Assistant Executive Director of the Association for the Advancement of Colored People, declared in Denver on 20 March that 1965 has the potential of a real revolution. A real revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, under the guise of a crusade for minority rights, Dr. Martin Luther King and other trained revolutionaries are today engaged in a plan to inflame Americans to a point where our citizens defy proper legal authority, and they flout private property rights, and finally, they generate violence, bloodshed, and murder. And you know this is true. You know this is true. Well, these, of course, are techniques of subversion that are familiar to anyone who has studied the Spanish Revolution or any other example of the communist technique of the control of populations through terror and tyranny. And so it's now apparent that certain agents provocateur, which is your word, Doctor, are acting in consonance with a master plan. A master plan which will create an atmosphere of crisis in the South, which will favor the declaration of a state of national emergency. And of course it can be predicted, very safely predicted, that this condition of national emergency will lead to the implementation of a series of executive orders which are now held in readiness to place control of all of the phases of our society into the hands of a few elite directors in Washington, D.C. This is the coming revolution. So you see, we begin to see the emerging outline of a Soviet America. A Soviet America. Now let's identify this master plan. This master plan which has spawned a generation of anti-Americans and which, of course, has entrapped our people in a silent revolution, but today threatens the South. And, of course, eventually the entire United States with violent insurrection. Because this is the pattern. This is the pattern. Well, permit me to quote from a Senate document number 87. And the title of this document is A Review of the United Nations Charter. And I quote page 289. And on page 289 there appears this amazing statement. Please pay attention to this. And I quote, the Charter of the United Nations has become the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or the laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding. End of quote. Did you hear that? our Senate tells us that we no longer have a Constitution. And of course they flaunt the United Nations banner. Well, I further invite your attention to an address by the late John Foster Dulles, who was the former Secretary of State, as you know. And Dulles made this talk before the American Bar Association in Louisville, Kentucky on 12 April 1952. And I quote Mr. Dulles, an authority. Treaties, said Mr. Dulles, make international law, and they also make domestic law. Under our Constitution, said Mr. Dulles, treaties become the supreme law of the land. Treaties become the supreme law of the land. In fact, said Mr. Dulles, they are more supreme than ordinary laws. For congressional laws are invalid if they do not conform to the Constitution, said Mr. Dulles, whereas treaty law can override the Constitution. End of quote. Treaty law can override the Constitution. Then Mr. Dulles spelled out the new legal posture which members of the American Bar Association would be expected to assume in future interpretation of the United Nations Charter as the supreme law of the land. And I'd like to quote a bit of that. Treaties, said Mr. Dulles, treaties can take powers away from the Congress and give them to the President. Now that sounds familiar. And they can take powers away from the state and give them to the federal government or to some international body. And they can cut right across the rights given to the people by the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Did you hear that? Treaties can take away your Bill of Rights. And they flaunt the United Nations banner. Now, this record of usurped governmental power, which Mr. Dulles presumed to sanction, is dramatically demonstrated in the record of hundreds of UN enforcing treaties, which were surreptitiously ratified by as few as 2 or 3 senators convening in secret during the months immediately following the passage of the United Nations Treaty Agreement. Now, this astonishing information was initially reported by the Chicago Tribune on 8 December 1952. In at least one instance, said the Chicago Tribune, one senator convened himself at 6:30 p.m. on the empty floor of the Senate chambers and ratified a treaty binding upon all American citizens, and then adjourned himself at 6:31. Think about that. That man, ladies and gentlemen, was Senator John J. Sparkman of Alabama. And you know this is true. Now, this abuse of privilege prompted Senator Bricker and some 53 other alarmed senators to propose Senate Joint Resolution number 1, which is, of course, the Bricker Amendment, on June 15, 1953, in an attempt to contain, by constitutional amendment, the treaty-making powers of the Senate and, of course, the executive agreement powers of the President. However, assurance by the President that such questionable action would be terminated led to the defeat of the Bricker Amendment by one vote. However, a recently conducted search for these secret treaties has revealed that the total now stands at over 3,000 secret treaties implementing the United Nations Charter. 3,000 UN implementing treaties, all secret. In fact, the Daughters of the American Revolution, a Mrs. Jones, tells me that there are over 4,000. Ladies and gentlemen, these interrelated events confirm a chilling fact, and that is that the United Nations Charter is a master plan for a communist-style revolution in America. It's the master plan. And so let us expose the fiction that the United Nations is some kind of a debating society. The United Nations is not a debating society, and it was never intended to be a debating society. The United Nations is a subversive organization. And its objective is to overthrow the constitutional government of the United States by peaceful means if possible, by force and violence if necessary. Now, I'm sure that these subversive objectives will not surprise those who know that the United Nations Charter was written by communists and traitors, including Alger Hiss, Leo Pasfalski, and Philip C. Jessup, to name just three. Just three. Because you see, this so-called United Nations treaty is no treaty in the sense of the word treaty. The United Nations treaty is a constitution for one world government. It's a constitution for one world government, and it has supplanted the Constitution of these United States. You see, we now actually have the Charter as the supreme law of these United States. And you know this is true. You know this is true. Because the United Nations now overtly and arrogantly proclaims its preeminence in the affairs of our state government. In fact, Dr. Ralph Bunche, who is perhaps the best known Negro in the world, Dr. Ralph Bunche is in the vanguard of defiant mobs who assault state capitals, the first one being in Montgomery. Now, of course, the pro-communist leanings of Dr. Bunche are very well known. In fact, on 9 August in 1948, after Alger Hiss had been exposed as a communist agent, Bunche assured Hiss in a letter that I want you to know I am on your side. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now crystal clear that federal agents acting under what they assert to be a legal use of the limited and delegated powers in the Constitution have in fact negotiated with foreign governments so as to force and coerce these United States into a United Nations treaty agreement. And this UN treaty actually constitutes a surrender of the United States and the powers of government to the United Nations. Now, I think that we ought to assess this duplicity, because we can, of course, give examples to show the extent of the takeover. So let us do that for a moment. For example, we have witnessed Supreme Court decisions which overturn the sovereignty of the state governments. The example being, of course, the reapportionment decision. We have been burdened by congressional legislation which directly attacks the constitutional premise of private property rights. Example, the Civil Rights Act. And of course now we are confronted by the arbitrary use of presidential power to override the constitutional guarantees of universal suffrage. And of course the example here is this proposed voting law. Now ladies and gentlemen, these acts by judicial, legislative, and executive agents violate specific articles in the United States Constitution and, of course, the constitutions of the several states. And they are certainly in contradiction to the intent and purpose of the Constitution. However, these acts are not in contradiction to the United Nations Treaty. In fact, these acts are demanded by the United Nations Charter. They are demanded by the Charter. And so the conclusion is inescapable. It is inescapable. Because since its ratification by our Senate in 1945, the United Nations Charter has become the supreme law of the land. And our elected and appointed agents in government, in the judicial, legislative, and executive office, have in fact conducted our affairs in consonance with the provisions of the United Nations Charter. This is the supreme law. Furthermore, this agony in Alabama promises that the technique of silent revolution to change our government from one of limited and delegated powers to a centralized totalitarian regime is to be reinforced by planned violence. And this violence is intended to expedite the changeover, you see. It will expedite the changeover. Now, I'd like to insert here a comment on the military aspect because our people are being exploited, you see, to help move our country into a revolutionary organization. Because the subversion of freedom's bulwark, meaning the Constitution, has been accompanied by a thrust to redirect the allegiance of our soldiers to the United Nations banner, so that U.S. military resistance will be denied during this United Nations takeover. As a matter of fact, the employment of U.S. military forces and federal troops in the South is but one example of this so-called counterinsurgency training which will facilitate the invasion. And you know that American soldiers today are being trained to control American citizens. And our sons in uniform are to suppress resistance to this United Nations takeover. And they are to aid these revolutionary forces which seek to destroy our Constitution and our country. And they'll do it with American troops in American uniforms. Now, I think you know that these planners that we mentioned, these planners intend to transfer our entire military establishment into a United Nations army, so as to force all of the nations into line and to deliver them up to a one world government. And our forces will help accomplish this objective. Well, of course, Americans have been assured that the constitutional legality of the United Nations Treaty Agreement is found in Article 6 of our Constitution, Article 6. And of course, Secretary Dulles, remember, stated that treaties are the supreme law of the land. But listen to this. A treaty cannot authorize what the Constitution forbids. No treaty can authorize what the Constitution forbids. And no federal agent has the power or the authority to modify or to dissolve the constitutional compact. No agent has this power. As a matter of fact, this was confirmed in positive terms in Reed versus Covert in 1957, in which the United States Supreme Court, excuse the expression, declared, and I quote, "It would be manifestly contrary to the objectives of those who created the Constitution Constitution, as well as those who were responsible for the Bill of Rights, let alone alien to our entire constitutional history and tradition, to construe Article 6 as permitting the United States to exercise power under an international agreement without observing constitutional prohibitions. In effect, such construction, said the Supreme Court, would permit amendment of that document in a manner not sanctioned by Article 5. The prohibitions of the Constitution were designed to apply to all branches of the national government, and they cannot be nullified by the executive or by the executive and the Senate combined. End of quote. Now you might say this is a strange decision to come from our Supreme Court, but there it is. There it is. However, our government has clearly demonstrated that the Constitution has been amended in a manner not sanctioned by Article 5. And it must be said, of course, that the Supreme Court cannot declare a statute of Congress unconstitutional. The court, of course, can exercise only the judicial power conferred upon it by the Constitution. Of course, it can no more unmake a piece of legislation than it can make one. You see, to strike down a legislative act, which we are talking about, the treaty is a legislative act. To strike down a legislative act requires legislative power, and no court has this power. No court has this power. And of course, the ordinary citizen lacks this power to overturn breaches of the Constitution. The ordinary citizen cannot correct breaches of the Constitution. So where do we go? Where do we go? Excuse me. Well, we have tried just about everything else. Just about everything else. And so now we come to the reason for me being here at all. What do we do about the usurpation of governmental power by this international organization, this organization which is now dedicated to the overthrow of our Constitution? Well, you see, only a state acting in its highest sovereign capacity can repudiate the unauthorized acts of its agents. The state, the sovereign state. Therefore, the proper party to now challenge these unauthorized and illegal acts and to challenge the validity of the United Nations Charter is a party to the Constitutional Compact, a sovereign state. The state of Massachusetts, or the state of Alabama, or the state of Georgia, a sovereign state. Now, the reason that our people, and of course the states, have been burdened by the acts of these federal agents in their surrender of the powers of government to the United Nations is because the states have not repudiated the acts of their agents. They have not repudiated the acts of their agents who acted beyond their authority. Now, these acts, therefore, had the effect of law, not by reason of any non-existent authority of these federal agents, but because of the authority the state gave to these acts by failing to repudiate them, by failing to challenge them. So, you see, the power to correct these excesses of the federal agents is found in our Constitution. In the Constitution. Let me quote to you just a bit of the Constitution in the preamble of the Constitution, and it says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, assure domestic tranquility, and provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. End of quote. So you see, the preamble to the United States Constitution clearly defines the authority of the parties to the Constitutional Compact. The sovereign states created the federal government. The federal government did not create the states. Well, you see, it's in the sense of the term states that they form the constituency which this federal constitution is based. Now, Martin Van Buren, who you know was our 8th president, said, "It is by the states," now listen to this, please, this is important. "It is by the states acting either by their legislatures or in convention that any valid alteration of the instrument, this Constitution, can alone be made." There are only 2 ways in which the Constitution can be changed, and that is by the states in Congress or in their legislative bodies. As we have seen, as it is a matter of historical record, however, that the Constitution of the United States has suffered not merely alteration, but complete abridgment by the passage of this so-called United Nations Treaty. United Nations Treaty. Now, this emasculation of our Constitution most certainly was not authorized by the parties to the Constitutional Compact. And you see, in this respect, our state office holders have a positive duty to enforce the provisions of the Constitution, and this is a continuing obligation. A continuing obligation. And it cannot be met merely by an empty oath upon accepting office. Because you see, the language of Section 3, Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution says, "shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution." Now this imposes a duty upon our office holders to support the Constitution. Support the Constitution. Therefore, in conformity with these duties and obligations, I now propose that the state legislatures of the state of Massachusetts or Alabama or Georgia or Mississippi or Michigan or what have you, I propose that the state legislatures do what is necessary to defend the Constitution and to protect the rights of the people. I think we can all agree that events in Washington disclose that we have lost the liberties and the freedoms guaranteed to the people under the Constitution. And certainly we have lost control of the federal government. We have lost control of the federal government. We have lost control of the federal government. I therefore suggest that the legislators of this state and any other state appoint a special committee comprising members of the House and Senate to investigate the legality of the action of these federal agents with regard to the United Nations, and to provide the means for the enforcement of the Constitution of the United States. I suggest that such a committee be authorized and directed to investigate the question of whether the United Nations Treaty Agreement, which was entered into by these federal agents who were acting as representatives of the states, acted in the authority given to these representatives by the states and granted to these agents by the Constitution. I suggest that this committee be further authorized and directed to investigate the question of whether this purported UN treaty agreement affects the state of Massachusetts or Alabama or Georgia or whatever state. Whether it affects the state or relates to the relinquishment of any of the laws or rights affecting the state or its people. Now this committee must determine whether there is any change proposed to be made under this United Nations treaty agreement which would deprive the state or its people of rights and privileges, or would involve any change in any of the provisions of the Constitution of the United States. Any change in the Constitution of the United States without the consent of the state or its people. And further, I suggest that this committee inquire into what measures may be taken by the state to enforce the Constitution of the United States and to punish any infraction that may appear to be endorsed by this unlawful use of authority. Now, when it is determined by this committee or commission that the United Nations Treaty Agreement is beyond the authority granted to these federal agents by our Constitution, I propose that the legislature of that state introduce a bill to provide for the enforcement of the Constitution with regard to this so-called United Nations organization. And I suggest that this statute declare that the agreements relating to the United Nations organization are beyond the authority granted to these agencies purporting to make these treaties and agreements, and are therefore null, void, and of no effect in that state. I further propose that any attempt to enforce the provisions of this said treaty or agreement within the boundaries of the state is unlawful. And lastly, I suggest that any person who shall commit an act in violation of this statute, that is, attempting to implement any part of the United Nations Treaty, shall be guilty of a felony, and upon conviction thereof shall be subject to judgment of up to $100,000 fine or 20 years confinement in the state penitentiary, or both. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in providing these criminal penalties for attempts to enforce acts which have no authority under the Constitution, the state legislatures is not asked to declare the Treaty of the United Nations unconstitutional. This is not the objective. We do suggest that the state legislatures first inquire into the question of whether there was any authority to enter into this United Nations Treaty Agreement. And upon finding that there was no such authority granted to these agents either by the states or by the Constitution, we suggest that criminal sanctions be enforced for attempting to effectuate in the state that which was never in legal existence. Never in legal existence. Now you see, the state legislature, by adopting this kind of a statute, will clarify and make definite the law in the state, and will discharge the state's obligation to ensure that the limits of the United States Constitution are respected within the borders of the state. Respected within the borders of the state. Ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations stands indicted as a subversive organization. A subversive organization. And its objective is the destruction of our Christian republic. Our Christian republic. And so I suggest that Americans must now join together to expose this evil. And to initiate the action, I am prepared at this time to offer to the state legislatures of any of the states a draft of the 2 implementing statutes that I briefly described during this talk. And I am prepared to offer into evidence the names and the backgrounds of 16 U.S. government employees, all of them agents for international communism, who contributed to the authorship of the United Nations Treaty. And I am prepared to offer into evidence a listing of 42 Senate investigations and reports which detail the subversive actions of the United Nations and its employees. And I am prepared to offer into evidence my own 10,000-word documented study of the men and the system, which has transferred our military establishment into the United Nations. Into the United Nations. And of course, at whatever time the legislature of Massachusetts or Alabama or Georgia may appoint such a legislative committee to investigate the United Nations Treaty, I will be pleased to suggest certain qualified witnesses who will offer testimony regarding the usurpation of governmental power and the surrender of our liberties to the United Nations organization without the consent of the people or the states. Now, these witnesses will include constitutional attorneys, general officers of the United States military establishment, civilian experts on the subject of UN subversion, and United States senators. Now, at the beginning of this presentation, I stated that I would talk to you this afternoon about my presentation to a joint session of the Alabama legislature. And we have, in fact, covered pretty much in detail about the proposal as it was presented to the legislators of Alabama. And I'd like to tell you here this afternoon that just before coming to this rally, I received a letter from Governor George C. Wallace of Alabama. And I'd like to read part of one paragraph that he states. The Alabama Commission to Preserve the Peace, chairman by Representative John Hawkins, plans to do a preliminary study prior to making specific recommendations to the legislature. Alabama has started their investigation of the United Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, we can and we must destroy the United Nations banner. We must destroy that. I may have to use it again. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time I would like to ask each and every one of you to join me in a crusade to restore the Constitution as the supreme law of the land, the Constitution. And I respectfully await your decision. Thank you very much.
Roberts. Now you know why we are so proud of our military men that have the courage to live up to their training. If more of our men, our officers, our outstanding officers, would come forth and tell what they know, as a few have done, I believe we'd save the country fast. Don't you? You get it?